Oh, hello. How are you?
Oh, thank you. Nice to meet you at a distance.
I'm Alison. I'm Alison Kobayashi. How are you? How are you inside of your home, I'm guessing, or are you in an office or
No, well, no, I'm locked in my apartment. I was born in France, but I'm currently in Spain. Are you at office?
I am at home also. I'm in New York City in Brooklyn. Up until pretty recently, I was doing a live performance actually called Say Something Bunny in New York, and it's based on a found audio recording from the 1950s. And in the performance, the audience and I listen to it together, and then I unpack all of the research that I did about this family. It's a project that's very like research heavy, but it's from this practice that I've had over the last decade or so of taking a found object that's kind of curious but mundane and ordinary, and then adapting that into a performance or a video or an illustration or an installation. And so I'm very interested in found objects and exploring those things to find stories that people kind of accidentally give away. So
Do you do research in order to nurture your performances, or are you a performer interested in doing research?
I think it would be
Or is
the
there a
second
debate?
of the two. What about you?
I'm also dealing with remnants of the past. Precisely the reason why I'm not in France is that I go wherever these remnants, I mean, the archive is stored. So I'm an historian. Well, an historian was interested in the past in as much as it has, something to tell to the present. Dealing mostly with those people whose voices have been repressed or even rather suppressed by official history, like native people in colonial settings, or the story of a child who was prosecuted by the Inquisition by the late 16th century. And I'm interested in those situations where two faraway societies located in faraway places, distant places, come to interact for the very first time. So I'm working mostly on the encounters between Southeast Asia and Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries.
And what brings you to Spain?
Well, actually, I'm a specialist of the Indonesian world or the Malay world, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So I started by working on the first encounters between the Dutch and the Japanese. And I switched to the Philippines because it's the same area, I mean, the same linguistic world. But then the European colonizer is not anymore, well, the Dutch or the French or the British, but rather the Spaniards. And the colonization of the Philippines was actually led from Mexico City.
Hmm.
And all the story of this first wave of colonization is stored in the archives in Sevilla. That's where you would find the letters by Columbus. And so I'm here mostly because I wanted to write a small book about Magellan, the very first circumnavigation of the world. It has begun 500 years ago, and we're entering a period of commemoration. And once again, Magellan is deemed as the true hero of the story. I wanted to try to write anew the story and to show that maybe the Philippine people could be considered as much as the hero, or at least the victims of the story. So for the past 2 years, every day I crossed the bridge to go to the archives and to try to uncover different testimonies about that first, circumnavigation of the world.
I research in a very different way, but I appreciate that you are physically going to the archive. I'm curious how that changes your process physically going there in discovery versus looking at material online.
Well, first of all, because not everything is online. An important section of the archives are in the process of being, digitized. But the most interesting part is precisely that which is not on the web. Still remains to be searched and in some cases uncovered. And the second thing is that, it's very important also to live in the places you're going to talk about in a book. So if you're going to talk about the Spaniards living Seville on the big ships in order to cross the ocean, better that you know a little bit about Seville, about its streets, the way the river, the Guadalquivir, was used by the sailors at the time.
Are you thinking more about the sailor's time on a ship and being in quarantine right now? Like that kind of being stuck in a place?
Yeah, in a sense, yes. Like the people at the time, I don't know where the ship is heading. But so I was curious, these objects, do you come across by pure chance?
So sometimes, like with the answering machines, I think that it was just part of my practice of going to thrift stores and looking at things, and then just discovering that these things were there, and so many answering machine tapes were just left in these old answering machines. But sometimes I've made a piece based on a letter that I just found on the street. In the case of Say Something Bunny, it was meeting someone who had this recording, and when I told them about the work that I was doing previously with found objects, they said, "Oh, I think you might really be interested in this recording." And then I heard it and was like, there's something really special. And I think that the thing that really connects all of the recordings that I'm interested in is they're really not about historical figures, but speak to, I think, a human experience that's often not documented. And also it's a documentation of life that's not through a memoir or creating a self-mythology that writing a diary would, or writing a memoir would. It's that kind of accidental capturing of life and the very boring moments. It's stuff that's often thrown away at an estate sale or something, you know?
And these objects can be from any period? Or?
It's really any period. A lot of this stuff is connected to the moment in time when a technology is also no longer relevant. So for example, the answering machines, that was kind of capturing probably late 90s, early 2000s technology when answering machines were being digitized. So everyone was updating it and then giving away their old answering machines. So sometimes the moment that these technologies capture are connected to the moments that the technologies are replaced. In the case of the performance Say Something Bunny, it's a recording from the 1950s. So that was kind of a new territory because it was so outside of my own experience that the research was just a really different process, because I was like, what was it like to grow up in the 50s? And they're making references to commercials and television programs that I had never heard of before. And so it was this deep dive into understanding, what are these people watching and how can I understand it?
There is a book by a British novelist that I like very much. It's a book from the 1950s. It's called The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley. It's a very old British style novel, but it begins with those words: the past is a foreign country. People do things differently there. When we enter the past, we have to enter it like if we are traveling in a faraway country with very language we do not yet understand. And this has been always very, very dear to me. If we go back in the past just to reassure ourselves that we are doing things the way we should do them, it's meaningless. History is interesting precisely at the point when it helps you uncover a world that you think is familiar, that is so strange, like when you were talking about those ads from the 1950s that are already pertaining to a lost civilization, so to speak.
It's funny because I feel like in some ways I try to undo that as much as possible. Like I think that the process of going into these documents and these archives is to make it familial and make it familiar, and to almost insert myself into that space. So to get so familiar with the set of references that you almost are part of the family. The recording that I was working with was quite difficult to hear and almost indecipherable at moments. So it was this repetitive listening. And like at this point, I've done the performance so many times that these people feel like family to me. Like I know entering the piece that I am the other, but the whole process of becoming familiar with the material is to try and make it family in a strange way. But it's funny too, because it's the performance that I'm working on, it's in a lens of being a creative project. And I think I try and set up like, I researched this, but I didn't actually meet the people who this is about. So it's speculation in some ways. It's my hypothesis and it's my best guess, but I might be wrong. And I think, foreground the performance with that information. I feel like a historian and journalists have a much different responsibility towards their research, but also have the same level of imagination and speculation.
I mean, I remember one of the very famous French historian, he once said, you cannot invent anything, but you have to imagine everything. So we do not invent, but we have to imagine. Just for recreating the setting and connecting the documents. Because the problem of the archives, for instance, is that it's just bits and pieces of something that actually does not make a round truth. So you have this guy talking about that that event, and other guy saying something very different about it, and your work is just to connect them and to build bridges between documents, and which is the name, I mean, that we could give to what an hypothesis is. It's a bridge between documents. So maybe we are wrong in the process. The question is also whether you are present as the one narrating the story or not in your performance. How does it work?
I'm very much myself, so I very much play myself, and then I go into playing these different versions of myself. So one of them might be me as a researcher, and then another one might be me as one of the characters in the recording itself, and then another one might be me as a director. So the other element of the performance is the audience is 25 people maximum, and they sit around a table, and what's kind of special about Say Something Bunny is each of the audience members is cast as one of the people heard in the recording. So you might sit down in a chair and you're just like, I'm here to watch a performance, and the performance starts and I say, you're the mom, you're Juliet, and you are married to George, and your sons are David and Larry. And so you enter the performance in this dynamic of being related to people. And it might be a person that you came with was your grandfather, and then it might be a complete stranger as your son. And I'm kind of directing you. And so the way of telling this story in the performance is almost through an actor's read through, where we have a transcript of the audio recording in front of us and listen to it and can read the words. And because you're playing Juliet, you might be more attuned to what she's saying, and then I pause and will give you direction or say, okay, you made everyone a cake, here's a piece of the cake. And so that's kind of the way into it. It's really trying to be immersive and invite the audience not only to see this family as a historical family, but almost as an actor who's going to prepare for a role to play this character. And so it's a different way.
It looks like role playing and you acting as the MC.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm hoping to guide people through it, but also through their imagination. So the set itself is just a table. We don't have a 1950s set. Trying to relate that experience that I had as the researcher to build that world, but that it doesn't have to be physically built. It's built in your imagination. I was going to ask you a question about creating that trust in the archive, and how there's some sources that you just really don't, they're useful, but you see how subjective it is.
Well, that's rather like a detective story. You don't have to trust anybody. But not in the sense that the people are lying, not even in the sense that they are lying to themselves. They all have their own truth about the event. I try never to arbitrate between different versions, but rather to put on stage all the versions. Because what is of utmost interest is not, that we just produce a very linear chronological narrative of events in order to say, well, things went that way, but precisely to have different points of view regarding what happened and what didn't happen, like in those situations of contact or conquest. The very first time the Dutch went to Indonesia, by the late 16th century, when they arrived in Asia, they were convinced that this was an event of, worldwide importance, and so they celebrated it in chronicles, paintings, and the Europeans, we reached these faraway places is something terribly important in world history. But when you look at the chronicles, that were being written at the time in Indonesia, and we have a number of them, exactly contemporary with the arrival of the Dutch, you don't find even a mention of the coming of the Dutch. And actually, because the Dutch came, with only 3 ships, and they were low-level traders, whereas these local Indonesian societies were having tribute with Imperial China, and with societies as far away as Mecca, for instance, in the Arabian Peninsula. And for them, the coming of the Europeans was of no importance at all. So we did not even record it. So in order to try to answer your question, it's not just about pursuing the idea of one single truth by piecing together different versions, but it's rather in the process of uncovering all these testimonies, all these narratives from the past, convincing oneself that there were many truths at play, and that people could have lived, through so different experiences of what went on, that it could, in some cases, not even have perceived the importance of the other. So indifference is a very important historical fact also. And Europe has always been persuaded, trying to persuade itself that it's the most and maybe the only one important player in world history. But the fact is that for many people around the world, I mean, Europe for a very long time was something like peanuts.
Is your writing, is it from your, who are you in your writing?
I'm in the text, mostly like a detective, saying that, yeah, we find this piece of evidence. We can interpret it that way, but if we do this, then we may miss something. So very often I stop in order to address the reader and to say, hey, no, we have to think a little bit more about this. We have to be careful. Like you as a performer, you are also role-playing yourself as the art director, so to speak.
Right.
I'm in my text also, but not by saying I, or by revealing anything about me, but talking as the guy who wants to share the secrets of his trade or craft. That's how we do things. It's very fragile, and that's why you should not believe anything you are told, whether by journalists or historians, because that's fragile stuff. You stage the performances, and it's with no more than 20, 25 people.
Yeah.
Do you record them also?
We documented it twice, but it's really because of the staging of the audience being cast as one of the characters, that the documentation really doesn't capture the experience of that's like to be sitting in the chair.
Well, you're producing archives for the future. Well, I mean, for future historians.
Potentially.
They will uncover your recordings,
Right.
So, terrifying. Imagine that someone like you will try to do with you what you're doing with the documents and the families you're interested in.
I researched it prominently between like the 2011 and 2015, 2016. And so, for example, the US Census was a really important element of the performance, but because the US Census is released 73 years, or it's some arbitrary number, 73 years from when it was taken, I didn't actually have the US Census from the year the recording was made. I had the US Census from 10 years before it. So if I had that census, I'm sure the story would be different because I'd have information of them from that actual moment.
But precisely in a sense, you're writing the story of, as you say, the ordinary people, but you're writing the story of yourself, writing the story of ordinary people.
Right.
Because it's potentially infinite, the archive that you would need in order to recreate a given historical moment. It's potentially everything that has been written and recorded at a given point in time. But if you could go through this, I mean, if you were God, probably you wouldn't write down the story. Because I think that if you give an historian each and every document that he needs, he will never write a single word of it because it's too much, and because precisely what makes the interest of doing this, slowly relating yourself in your own ways with something, would be lost in the process. That makes for a human story.
And a flawed story as well, which I think is part of the strategy that
God has nothing to say,
Right.
God who knows anything, has nothing to say. He's never written down anything.
So I also work at Union Docs, which is a non-for-profit about documentary. So there's a workshop that's coming up about films about the museum, specifically like an institution that is about creating history and representation of history and preserving objects of history. But two filmmakers who are presenting in this workshop are brothers Adam and Zach Khalil, and they made a film called, it's a short film, The Violence of a Civilization Without Secrets. It's their Egyptian and indigenous, I think are really approaching making films about these histories like in a really interesting way. And
I was thinking about this movie by a Japanese filmmaker, Kurosawa, Rashomon, which is actually based on a novel written by the early 20th century. A movie about the murder of a samurai. You follow actually the inquiry, the trial, in order to try to identify the murderers. And it's very interesting because in the process of trying to unveil all the versions of a given event, you begin to question the very fact that something like a murder happened. And I don't tell you the end of the movie because it's...
Thank you so much for chatting. That was so delightful.
No, that was wonderful. No, it's a very nice encounter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.